welcome.
בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב.
Shav-
רק נשים פה?
כרגע.
So it seems.
Good
אנחנו
morning.
רוצים ללמוד איתכם.
Eleanor, your Hebrew classes are paying off. You sound great.
תודה רבה, הרב שלי.
So good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. I told Yael that it's a beautiful day. I don't know. I think most of you are in New York. It's a beautiful day here in New York. Last weekend was so hot and sticky, and I think folks may have chosen to spend the morning outside. But we're delighted that you're here, and I think hopefully a few more folks will join us. I think it's going to be a great conversation and learning this morning. Eleanor, we've got a man in the waiting room, so here we go.
But I have to approve him. Oh, he's a good one. He's a good man.
I always used to say it's wishful thinking on my parents' part.
Before you came, I said only women are here to study Torah from Israel. And then Rabbi Shuli said, oh, a man's in the waiting room. So I quit. Let me approve him.
There you go. And I'm deeply in touch with my feminine side, so I have no issue.
Great. Well, welcome one and all of all genders and any genders. We're delighted that you are choosing to learn some Torah with us this morning. I'm very excited. I just met Yael right now on this Zoom, but I've been really looking forward to this program because I'm sort of fascinated to see, Yael, how you bring us into an awareness and understanding of issues related to disability through the study of Torah and biblical text. Dr. Yael Avrahami is a biblical studies professor at the Oranim Academic College of Education. She is the author of The Senses of Scripture, Sensory Experience in the Hebrew Bible. You can read her full bio on the website. She's a Fulbright scholar and an author and teacher of many other important and interesting things. But I will say that the thing that I was very moved by in your bio, Yael, was the last line that you gave to us, that you are amazed that how reading ancient texts can improve our understanding of contemporary cultures and minds. And I have a sense that's what you're going to be bringing to us today, at least in part. And it's so very true how we can read and mine the Torah and biblical text, ancient texts, and come to new awareness and understanding of our own selves and our own contemporary world. So we're really thrilled to have you here as our final Torah from Israel speaker in the series this year. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Shuli, and thank you for inviting me. I'm also very thrilled to talk to you. It's amazing to be in New York while I'm still in Haifa. Here it's the late afternoon. I'm going to be with you until sunset, and I'm going to see through the window as we speak. So it's going to be a nice end of the day for me, and I hope we're going to have fun. As I told Shuli before, I'm very happy for an informal conversation, so feel free to ask me anything, argue with me, disagree with me, question what I'm saying. I am a biblical scholar, and I do dedicate my life to studying these texts, but I often find that other people have very interesting things to say, and I'm happy to hear them and to think about things together. So let's just jump in. And, you know, when Abir approached me and asked me to talk about something, I was really thinking about what can I talk about that's going to put what for me is the most important thing, these connections between ancient texts and our contemporary lives, and the ways that these texts still influence our lives. And even if we don't choose to follow, you know, the full religious path or in its orthodox way, still our lives are very much influenced by those narratives, by those ideas, by those symbols that we find in the Tanakh, in the Bible. And for me, it was really important to choose something that can talk about this relationship. And we spoke about different things. I was really into something more light, I would say, something in popular culture, or I don't know. But Avir said that you like more, you know, deep learning. So we decided to talk about disabilities. And I did prepare a little presentation for you, which I'm also happy to send to you if you will want. And I'm going to jump in and out of this presentation. So we called this talk, The Torah and Disabilities. What can we learn about the Bible and about ourselves? So it sounds very big, and I hope that in 1.5 hours we can really say something meaningful about this subject. So the Torah and Disabilities is a very big subject in the last, I would say, decade or so. It became a big issue in biblical scholarship, disability studies, and it has to do with studying the ways that the ancient Hebrews thought about the body, the place of people with disabilities in society, and of course, what's kind of grew out of these biblical notions into later religions like Judaism, Christianity, etc. And I want to start with what's, you know, if I would go to a kind of a normal, and I want to start with something that led me in my own looking at the subject, or any other subject really, of ancient cultures and ancient minds. And that is that when we read an ancient text, so we can do it in many different ways. I'm going to stop for a minute because otherwise you'll just read what's on the screen and not listen to me. So when we approach a text, any text or any culture that's not our own, and it can be a culture that just lives somewhere else in our times, but it can also be an ancient culture that we approach through a text, through a written text, like, you know, the ancient Hebrews in the Hebrew Bible. When we approach them, I think many times we come with our own perceptions and with our own notions and with our own demands of the text. Like, we want the text to be something, and we come with our own understandings of the world into the text. And when I started to study, you know, the body in biblical literature, the senses, disabilities, all these topics, I realized that really the anthropologists in the last, I would say, 50 years have realized that really different cultures and different times think differently about the body, and think differently about the senses, and think differently about disabilities. So when we come to read the text, we really should be sensitive to its own meaning before we want to, you know, see what we can do with the text. So yeah, we will get there. We want to see how it's related to us and what we can do with it and how we can relate to it. But first, we have to understand it on its own, so to speak. So this is kind of my leading idea in biblical studies generally, not only when I speak about disabilities. And for that, I was bringing kind of two quotes of my favorite anthropologists. One is very famous, both American anthropologists. One is very famous, Ruth Benedict, which claimed, "We do not see the lens through which we look." And for me, when I read the Hebrew Bible, I want to pay notice to my own lenses and to see, you know, it's on its own, as I said. And the other is from Michael Hertzfeld, who's a contemporary anthropologist, American anthropologist. And he said something that for me was kind of mind-blowing, and it was, "Common sense is seriously misnamed. It is neither common to all cultures, nor is any version of it particularly sensible from the perspective of anyone outside its particular cultural context." And when it comes to disabilities and the senses, what it means is that maybe for me, I take for granted certain understanding. For example, that people with disabilities have the same rights as anyone who doesn't have a disability. But this is the perception of my culture. For me, it's a common sense. Obviously, people with disabilities have the same rights as people without disabilities. But that was not obvious. That was not the common sense for the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible, because they lived in a different time. And we can find it in many topics, right? We can find it with, you know, how we look at relationships, how we look at gender, how we look at, you know, even, you know, topics like slavery, that the Hebrew Bible did not have the same common sense that we have common sense. And I'm saying it in the beginning of my talk because some of the things I'm going to present are going to be annoying. What I mean is that the Hebrew Bible is sometimes very annoying, and it says things that I disagree with. And it's important for me to say it in the beginning, because sometimes people are like, "Oh no," you know, kind of surprised by what we read in the Hebrew Bible, and also expect it to have the same sensibilities, the same morals, the same common sense as us, but it doesn't. So this is kind of a disclaimer before we begin, and let's go straight to the text. So I hear that some of you study Hebrew, but I did choose to bring all the quotes in translation. And I used the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version translation, which I generally prefer. And, you know, if I went to, you know, a kind of an ordinary Torah teacher, Sunday school teacher, and I would say, you know, what does Judaism have to say about people with disabilities? What does, you know, the Bible say about it? I guess that I would hear back these two quotes, and they are very famous quotes. You know, "You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind," which is the demand not to hurt someone with disabilities, not to take advantage of their difficulties, of their physical difficulties, which is considered a basic moral demand in Judaism. And another one is from Deuteronomy, but it's a similar idea. It's brought in Deuteronomy in the context of kind of a public oath, like all the people hear a certain sentence and then they say amen, like we agree to do that. And one of them is, "Cursed be anyone who misleads a blind person on the road." And all people shall say amen. So as a congregation, as a group, everyone has to agree not to mislead a blind person. And when I talk here in this example on the blind person, it's important for me to say that really I'm talking about any kind of difficulty, of physical difficulty, because in the Bible, many times the blind is kind of the symbol for anyone with a difficulty. So it's kind of the, you know, the main example, but it stands for other things as well. So if I just, look at it at first glance, everything looks perfect. Judaism is very moral, and it demands from the community to pay attention to people with disabilities and not to mislead them, not to hurt them. But as you might guess, this is only kind of the starting point, because I think, and what I want to show you in the next few slides will be that really when we start to look in details into the Tanakh, we find that this demand was not always obeyed, meaning that when you ask people to behave, that's probably because some people don't behave. We can say it about many laws, right? You don't need a law if everyone, just does the right thing. Usually you make up a law when things are not quite, working out. And in the case of these two sayings about, not misleading the blind and the deaf, I think that we have here a moral demand, but this moral demand stands on the background on a very harsh reality. And I want to talk a little bit about this reality in the Hebrew Bible from three points of view. One is the legal point of view, one is the literary point of view, and one is the more, I would say, poetic and linguistic point of view. And after looking at these 3 points of view, we can think maybe together, about this gap between the moral demand and the rest of the evidence. Again, how we can explain this gap, maybe. So I'm going to go back to my slide, and I chose one law, and this is a piece from Leviticus. Leviticus, is a book that deals a lot with the cult, how to work in the temple, what kind of sacrifices you need to bring, who's allowed to bring them. And everything has to be right in Leviticus. You have the certain times and you have the certain amounts, and everything has to be right. They were very, obsessed with being punctuous and and one of the things is who can be a priest and who can go and perform the rites in the temple. And here is one of them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say, no one of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish," in Hebrew it's mum, that's the word, "who has a blemish may approach to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, one who is blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long, or one who has a broken foot or a broken hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a blemish," oops, something is hiding me, "in his eyes, or an itching disease, or a scabs, or a crushed testicles." I know that's very particular, but it's one of the things that are written here. Sorry. Where am I? "No descendant of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near or offer the Lord's offering by fire, since he has a blemish. He shall not come near or offer the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, of the most holy as well as of the holy, but he shall not come near the curtain or approach the altar, because he has a blemish, that he may not profane my sanctuaries. For I am the Lord, I sanctify them." So what does this text mean? This is really a priestly text. It has to do with who's allowed to perform the ritual of the sacrifice in the tabernacle or in the temple. And you can already see that this text is not, for me, it's really hard to read it out loud because it doesn't work with my own, morals and understandings. But this is the text, I cannot hide it. And what we see here is that there is a very deep understanding of disabilities of different kinds, because there was a long list there, right? There were some things that today we will call disabilities, other things we would call maybe skin disease. So there are different kind of physical situations that prohibit a person from serving God. And they prohibit this person from serving God because that person would profane the temple. So this is a very harsh thing to say. You know, you are profane, you are profaning the space. This doesn't work very well with the nice sentence that we heard before about, you know, you shall not, you know, put a stumbling block, you know, a stumbling stone before the blind, or you should help people and you should be nice. So we can see here that they thought about, at least the priest, in the way I read this text, they thought about the physical state as something that possesses also a more deep state of, you know, holiness or lack of holiness. So they thought that it's not just the body. They really thought that the body holds certain qualities that are related to the physical body, and if you don't have the physical body or the typical physical body, you know, the normative physical body, then you cannot have all the full, you know, range of, I would say, positive attributes that are mental or spiritual. So this is a very harsh way to begin our conversation, I know, but I chose to start from it because I wanted to show you this contrast, and it's a problem. And I think as we go on with our talk, we will have to also think, like with other topics, how do we as contemporary Jews deal with this harsh statement? You know, how do we I don't know, what do we do with it? You know, and we meet it everywhere. We meet it, you know, and we meet the way the Bible speaks about other nationalities. But here, I came here today to tell you that there is another thing on our list. It's another problem for me, at least, you know, as a Jewish person. So that was the legal realm. I have to say that Tanakh itself doesn't talk a lot about disabilities in the legal realm. You can mostly find it in the context of temple. But later on in rabbinic Judaism, we still have the same people who are deaf cannot testify. They're not accepted to testify. So what does it mean if someone is not accepted to testify? That means that the people who decided, you know, the laws of who can testify and who cannot testify, they thought that if you have certain disabilities, you are somehow cognitively affected by it. Otherwise, why would they say that you cannot testify, right? So they linked emotional spiritual, right? So they made this connection that we today, at least I hope that everyone here as well, tend not to make. So we don't make this connection. We don't assume that, you know, because someone has a physical disability, that influences other aspects of their being. Nancy, did you want to say something? Yeah. No.
Yeah, no, yes, I just read it. Factually, the assumption that a physical disability entails a cognitive disability is just simply not correct. So they may have thought that at a time when they really didn't know any better.
I 100% agree with you. You said it, you know, perfectly the same way that I believe as well, and they didn't know it. They didn't know it, or they didn't think that way, and they didn't know it. So we have the legal realm, and the legal realm is problematic. And in some ways, I would say, we will find that not only the legal realm is problematic, because I want to talk to you a little bit about the literary realm. You know, I do a lot of literary work in my studies, and what's interesting to see is that in the Hebrew Bible, and actually in other ancient cultures as well, when you have a character that has a disability, 99 out of 100 times, it is not only a physical trait, but it also symbolizes something, you know? So I gave here 3 examples. And these 3 examples, I'm going to talk about them a little bit. One is Eli the priest. You know, at the beginning of the book of Samuel, Eli, that's how you say it in English? Yeah? Eli, okay. So Eli the priest, he becomes blind. And you can say, well, that's just a fact, right? It's just a fact that he becomes blind because he grew old and his eyes became dim. And we can also, you know, explain it physically, you know, that most of people lose some of their sight as they grow older. I'm one of those people. So you can say, well, this is just a fact. But when you read the story, you see that it's not just a fact, because immediately after we're told that he is getting blind and he doesn't see very well, his sons start to sin, and he doesn't metaphorically see what they're doing. So him being blind is not only a physical trait in the story, it's also a metaphorical saying about him, meaning he can't see, you know, we use it in English as well, he can't see what's going on, not physically, mentally, like he doesn't know what his kids are doing, he doesn't see what's going on, he doesn't see that they are sinning. And that's very clear from the story, that his blindness is not merely a physical fact of being old. It's also, you know, part of the fact that he cannot, his children are not going to inherit the priesthood from him because he can't see what they're doing and they're doing wrong. And if that's not enough, he's presented with a little kid. His name is Samuel. And this little kid comes to the shrine, you know, comes to be with him and to serve with him under his guidance. And this kid starts to hear and see things that they can't see anymore. And one who sees.
Yael, you're breaking
And-
up a little bit. I don't know if there's you're freezing a little bit. So I don't know if there's a way you can.
Sorry. Yeah. I'll try to fix it. 1 second. Okay, I think now it will be better.
Okay, great. Thank
I don't know why it moved to the other router without me asking it to do it.
Misbehaving. Yaeli,
Yeah.
you left off at the penultimate. You were going to tell us about Mephibosheth. And then
Yeah.
we lost you for a minute.
Okay, so I just concluded that the character of Eli, like other blind characters in the Tanakh, is also metaphorically, I would say, blind, meaning he doesn't, you know, understand what's going on. And I have many other examples for that. Maybe the most interesting one or the most famous one is Isaac, you know, because when Isaac, he gets old and he becomes blind, his wife and son deceive him in a almost comic way, it's one of those things that make you think, really, you're gonna pet someone who's wearing a skin of an animal and think it's your son? I mean, really, the character of Isaac in his last days, being blind and being fooled by his family, even though it's kind of the divine plan, still as a character, as a human being, when I read this story, he's really presented as pretty much a fool. So his blindness is not just, a fact. It's kind of the background to why they can deceive him, why he doesn't understand things as he used to. So really, I think it's a similar thing. So that's the blind people. And it's very rare to find positive, I would say, blind characters. We have one prophet, a blind prophet in the book of Kings, but usually that's not the case. Second example is Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is one of the sons of King Saul. He is lame, meaning he doesn't walk well, which, it's a very, I would say, minor disability. And in the story, he is the last one that is left from the house of Saul. And he's, of course, presented not only as, having some kind of a walking disability, but also he is presented as dependent. He's dependent in his servants, and his servants can betray him, and they can steal from him, which they do, and they get half of his property, and the king can manipulate him, King David. So his character doesn't only have, a physical disability. We can really see how it affected his life. So even though he's, theoretically at least, he is the right inheritor of King Saul, he's a son of a king, and in a way, he could have maybe tried to continue kingship. He is presented as a pretty miserable person who is dependent on others all the time. And he also, in that dependence, in that disability, marks symbolically, the end of the dynasty of Saul. Like, what's left of the dynasty of Saul? That the cripple. And I'm saying the cripple, it's a hard word, but it's almost like a Shakespearean, play, because Shakespeare was not very PC, and he presented disabilities a bit like the Hebrew Bible, right? Obviously, if you're disabled, you're the villain. Obviously, you understand I'm cynical about it, I hope, and that's the way it is. So the Hebrew Bible is a bit like this. Mephibosheth, he's not a villain, but he's definitely presented as a very weak, dependent person because of his disability. And symbolically, he marks the end of Saul's dynasty. And by the way, it's not only the Saul's dynasty. At the end of the book of Kings, when we hear about, the fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the exile, so the last king of Judah, who is a Davidic descendant, who's from the family of King David, he's blinded by the Babylonians. So here again, this is something for me, literary, not literally, from a literary point of view, it's a symbol, because the end of the dynasty is marked with damage to the body, and specifically to sight, which is very symbolic. Why am I saying that it's very symbolic? Because on the other hand, when you want to say that someone lived a full life in the Bible, you say they've seen their great-grandchildren. So they've seen with their own eyes their great-grandchildren. That is to live, a full, good life. So to punish someone by blinding, that they're not going to see physically their descendants, that's a big symbol. that's something symbolic. It's very deep. I want to say, yes, Eleanor.
You know, in listening to you, I'm thinking about Mephibosheth and how King David took, if my memory is correct, took a special protexia over Mephibosheth.
That's true.
And it's interesting in the context of, you know, because we know that King Saul was trying to kill David in their prior years. And yet, I think it's after he's gone, he then becomes the protector of Mephibosheth. So I think there's an undercurrent in your thesis about the disability uh, as against the Tanakh, really. Here, you know, he might have been minimized and ignored and abandoned, and King David puts him under a special protection. I offer to your expertise.
It's interesting, you know, because I think, and we will get to it as well later, but I think there are many ways to look at what King David is doing in this aspect. So we do know that Mephibosheth had many lands, and he was a rich person, and I think when King David is taking him under his, you know, protection and putting him on his table, that's what's written, that he becomes from the people who eat on his table. You can look at it as, you know, an act of grace and protection, but you can also look at it in the way that David is making sure that he can control what this man is doing, meaning that he has close eye on him. This is not specifically with disabilities. I mean that when the king puts someone on his table, it can be a help, but it can also be an act of control. So I think it's a delicate thing. And what happens later, after the rebel, is that King David takes half of Mephibosheth's property, and he has many lands, and he takes half of it and gives it to Mephibosheth's servant. So King David does strip Mephibosheth from half of his possessions. So it's hard for me to look at what King David is doing as 100%, you know, grace and help. I think it's complicated, and we're talking here about, you know, two important men. So it's interesting, you know. I cannot solve it 100% because I wasn't there, but I thank you for the question, because I think it will lead us. We will talk later about this concept of I call it grace, the concept of grace and disabilities. I think it's very central, and we will go back to it later. So thank you.
Thank you.
So the last example I wanted to give, and I wanted to give it because we don't tend to look at it as disability, but I think that the Bible does look at it as disability. That's infertility. So of course, in the times of the Bible, they didn't know that men can be infertile too. They thought it's only women that can be infertile, and it was a disability. When Rachel cannot get pregnant, she says, I'm sure you all remember that. She says, you know, give me sons or I will die. You know, if I don't have sons, I will die. And it's really hard to understand. Like, again, you can interpret this call for help, or this, you know, call in many ways. You can interpret it and say, well, she will suicide. I don't think so. But you can also understand that she's going to be dead socially, meaning that she doesn't have a space in society if she doesn't have a male son. And that has to do with the structure, the social structure in biblical times, and the economical social structure in biblical times, which we will not go into in big details, but you know that in biblical times, the way it works is that your first male son has to support you financially when you grow older. And that's why they get more of the share. So they will have a way to support you. So there is this whole economic system. But if you don't have a male son, so who is going to support you? And that means that, and similarly, if you have a disability that stops you from being married, again, who is going to support you? Because if you don't have children to work the land to support you, really, there is no, social security in ancient Israel. So what we have here, what's similar about it is that if you're disabled and you find it hard to get married and have children, or if you are infertile, it's kind of the same consequences, socially and economically. And I think they looked at it as a kind of a disability. And why do I say it? Because just like other disabilities, they thought that it comes from God and God can heal it. So they had this understanding that just like God, created man and the spirit and the world, God created also the disabilities, and God can cure from disabilities. So they had this very, theological notion of disabilities, and that has to do with the next point that I wanted to share with you. So we spoke about the legal realm and we spoke about the literary realm. And what I want to talk about now is more the symbolic realm. And the symbolic realm is something that we all know, right? Symbolic realm is all these range of things that come into our mind when we hear a word. If I hear a certain word, naturally, it happens to everyone. That's the way our brain works. When we hear a certain word, our brain automatically brings up different associative patterns, symbols, notions, understandings, and these things are dependent on our culture. So what we've learned through what our parents told us, what we learned in school, what we read in books, what we saw in the movies, all these things come to our mind when we hear a certain word. So if, let's say, I hear the word marriage, I don't know, so it will bring up, certain ideas and notions, and maybe for, a Jewish woman from New York, it will bring different notions than from, a male man from India. The same word, right? And it's the same with things related to the body. Because if you went to a biblical person and say, oh, look, excuse my language, hey, look, here's a fat woman, and say, wow, the most beautiful thing, the most healthy thing. In biblical Hebrew, the word for healthy and the word for fat are the same word. It's the same word. They didn't have separate words for that, because for them, being fat means being healthy because you have enough food, So if I came to a biblical person and say, hey, look at this fat lady, they would think one thing. But if I went to a contemporary person, in New York and say that word, first, they would have, different associations and thoughts come into their minds, but also they will think something about me, right? They say, who is that rude person? In biblical times, they would say, oh, she's giving that person a compliment. So as you can see, words bring up, thoughts and symbols and a lot of symbolic load that are dependent on the culture in which you use these words. You use the same Hebrew, but you use it now in Israel, or you used it, 3,000 years ago in Judea. It's not the same word. So this is a general thing about the way that language work and that words work. So with that, we can look at the symbolic realm. And as I already said, sadly, in the Hebrew Bible, I found many examples where physical disability is considered to have to do something with cognitive or mental disability. And I brought only 2 examples, but there are so many of them. One is, I found that wisdom is superior to folly. Well, that's okay. As light is superior to darkness. A wise man has his eyes in his head, whereas a fool walks in darkness. So really what we have here is an analogy, right? We have the wisdom and the folly, the smart and the folly, the wise guy and the folly. And they are like light and darkness, which are not neutral words, right? Light is a good thing. Darkness is not a good thing in the Hebrew Bible. Darkness is, not a good thing. So we have the wise and the folly, and they are parallel to light and darkness. And the wise man, he's the one that has eyes in his head. So he's the one that can see. And the fool, he walks in darkness. So he's a blind. So you can see that here, this is something that's supposed to be, it's from Ecclesiastes. It's supposed to just be kind of a saying about how the world works. But the analogy that is used to explain who is wise and who is, not wise, the wise is the one who can see. So obviously, if you can't see, you're not wise. You see where I'm getting. So this kind of analogy is very, very common in the biblical wisdom literature, for example. And, it is still very, very common also in spoken English, right? Nowadays, it's still very common to use this word, blind as a negative thing. He's blind to the facts. He can't see what's going on. How are you fool? You can't see what I'm explaining. So we still use, and it's very hard not to use because it's so deep in our language. We still use, the idea of not seeing as a derogative, as something, basically negative, something that has to do with not understanding. And the Hebrew Bible is full of that. I gave one more example here. It's from Jeremiah. And he's, reproaching Judea. He's angry. Jeremiah is the angry prophet. He's always angry. And he's saying, oh, foolish people, devoid of intelligence, that have eyes but can't see, that have ears but can't hear. So how does he explain, their foolishness? That they don't see. They are blind. They are deaf. And in other verses, he actually uses this word. So again, he's kind of making this parallel that on the one hand, when you just hear it in context, it sounds okay. But when you think about it deeply, you think about the structure that it embeds in us, in our brains, you start to understand the problematic aspect of it. I hope you understand what I'm trying to show here. And another thing is something that has to do between the symbolic realm and the actual physical realm, and that is disabilities marginality. So we already spoke about, the social economical status of people that don't have children, especially male. They have to have male son, at least one, to have, to be protected when they grow older and can't work. And this is only one of the things that can cause marginality. So that's one thing. But of course, we have today a lot of technical solutions that help people, you live independently, which they didn't have. So, usually you find a blind described as, groping in darkness, falling, stumbling into stones. Well, they didn't have these dogs, that, and all those things. So when I spoke about disability and marginality, I speak about actual marginality, meaning actual problems like getting married, having children, walking around, working, things like that, but also about the symbolic marginality. So you're considered as marginal. And you can see it. I gave 2 examples. One is from Jeremiah. It's a comfort prophecy. So it's how God is going to bring back people to Judea. And what's interesting for me is who is described together. See, I'm going to bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the farthest parts of the earth. Among them, the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor together, a great company, they shall return here. So really, Jeremiah is giving us hope that everyone is going to go back, even the ones that you would think will not be able to make the way, right? So even a woman in labor or even the blind, even them, God will bring them back. That's a big miracle. That's making the promise of return a very big promise, because when people imagine how they're going to go back, really I don't think they thought about, is everybody going to be able to walk this whole way? And here we see, and that's kind of a positive thing, we see here in Jeremiah a promise that God will return everyone, not only those who can walk by themselves. Everyone is going to return. So this shows us that people did look and see disability as something that is putting you in a difficult state. And if I'll go back to what I've read in the beginning, from Deuteronomy, I read, cursed be anyone who misleads a blind person on the road. And all the people say amen. And look what the next oath is. Cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, and the widow of justice. All the people say amen. Now, for me, it's nice to look at these 2 sentences that are one next to the other. Chazal used to call it smichut parshiot, like two things that come together, there is a reason. What's the reason that these 2 things come next to each other? And for me, this is one example, but I have many of them in the Bible. People with disabilities are usually mentioned with the widow, the alien, the orphan, meaning people who need protection, people who need social help. So this shows us, and just like, the widow and the poor and the orphan, this holds both a practical difficulty and a symbolic load. So it's not this one or this one, it's both. And I think that even us as a more progressive society, I would hope so, it's very hard to get rid of this symbolic load. It's very, very, very difficult. It's rooted in us for thousands of years, and we find it very hard to get rid of it. At least, I'll be honest, I sometimes find myself saying things and then like, did I say that? Because it's very hard to stop thinking in those metaphors, in those symbols that we've been reading for 2,000 years. So it's hard for us to get rid of them. So we also have to be, patient with ourselves. I want to go to the last symbolic matter, And for me, it's very interesting. I already mentioned it in brief, and that is the theological context of disability. And maybe that's very interesting for a community that also wants to find a theological meaning in all of this, and a more, a personal message. And for that reason, this is maybe the most problematic one even. So I'll start with maybe an obvious thing to say, but God created the senses. One of the nice places, nice texts that say it out loud is from Exodus. So I see I didn't put the reference. It's Exodus 4. It's when Moses is chosen to lead the people, and he starts to argue with God. No, I can't go. I can't talk. They won't listen to me. You know the story. And then God, becomes angry at him because he keeps arguing all the time, Moses. And then God says, it's actually written that God becomes angry. And then he says, then the Lord said to him, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? So I create the senses, I create these abilities, and I decide if you can talk or you can't talk, or you can see or you can't see. So of course, if I decide you can go and talk to the children of Israel, you can go and talk to them. So this is God's reproach of Moses. But theologically, what we can learn from this passage and from other passages as well is that the ancient Hebrews believed that, like other things, God has created the senses and the abilities of the body. So the senses, I mean, as something that a person is able to do. They didn't think like later Greek philosophers that, the mind is, divine and the body is beastly, and all these weird ideas that became so popular in the last, 2,000 years as well. They didn't look at it that way. They really thought that our bodily abilities are as divine as our cognitive abilities. They looked at it in that way. They didn't read, Plato or Aristotle. So they didn't hear about this interesting idea that our cognitive abilities are divine and that our bodily abilities are earthly. They didn't hear this concept. For them, any ability of the person is divine. And therefore, if you don't have any one of those abilities, that means God's chose you not to have them. And we hear it with, infertility very often in the Hebrew Bible, like God has closed her womb, It's written there. God decided that. And we hear it in other places when maiming or causing a disability is considered a divine punishment. So it's considered, of course, a human punishment. Armies did it to especially to officials, like we heard with the last king of the Davidic kingdom. But also, it's also a divine punishment. For example, in Deuteronomy, there is a list of, divine punishments that are going to happen to you if you don't obey the law. And one of them is this one. The Lord will strike you with madness, blindness, and numbness of heart. You shall grope at noon as a blind man gropes in the dark. You shall not prosper in your ventures, but shall be constantly abused and robbed with none to give help. It's pretty awful. I know I'm reading some awful passages today. Maybe I should have spoken about Bob Marley after all, but which was my other suggestion. But look at this curse. This curse is pretty harsh, but first it brings together, madness, blindness, and numbness of heart, whatever that means. And it details, what does it mean to be struck with those disabilities, mental or physical disabilities that we hear about here. What does it mean? It means that you will not prosper and you'll be abused and you'll be robbed. Yes, Seth.
I'm having some difficulty reconciling what you taught us at the beginning, where Hashem himself says, you profane me if you bring somebody who has a disability to, what is it, the Kodesh HaKodeshim or something, to make offerings. And this discussion about the fact that these disabilities are divinely given. I can't reconcile those two concepts.
Okay, I will try to reconcile it. First, I will say maybe a general thing. I think that, okay, I'll first reconcile it and then I'll say something else, okay? I think
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that it has to be reconciled, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. What I wanted to say is that I think that I don't think you have it, but the anticipation that many modern readers have from the Tanakh to be consistent is non-realistic. It's not. So this is just like the way it is. And I'm happy to give a talk to people who seem to understand what I'm saying because you're all nodding. Because some of my students have a very difficult time accepting this idea. I'm teaching young people. They're, 22, 23, and it's very hard for them to realize that the Torah is not consistent. But in this respect,
sorry, Yael, can I just jump in and ask, would you say that in this case, I mean, I could imagine that in this case, the lack of consistency, a scholar like yourself would say is due to it being from two different authors with different priorities. And for the priestly author, order and perfection is very, very important. And so there cannot be any mum, there cannot be any blemish, whereas that's just different for the Deuteronomy.
Yeah. Yes and no. I think there is a different sentiment with the priestly author or the priestly sources or any text that is really dedicated to the priests in the temple. In the Hebrew Bible, they really tend to be very aware of separating things, and being aware with, what's profane and what's not profane, whereas other texts in the Hebrew Bible don't seem to be so obsessed with it. So that's part of it. But but in this case, I don't think that in the deep meaning, I think what's interesting about reading cultural notions in the Hebrew Bible, which is what I do, is that it goes beyond like documents, because really many times you find that on the deeper level of the cultural sensibility about a certain topic, really there is agreement between all of them. They maybe say it differently, but deeply what they think is very similar, because the priestly source, the priestly source here says, being disabled is being, impure, basically. And and Deuteronomy here says, the Deuteronomic source here says, being disabled is being abused, marginal, unimportant. These are not very far notions. When you only look at what they think about the disabled, you leave a little bit the theology. With the theology, I think it's also not very different, because many times there are things that God wants distance from, okay? So God doesn't like people who are maimed in Leviticus. He doesn't want them in the temple. But this God that doesn't like, certain things, he also, when he wants to push Israel away from him because they've sinned, he will put those same things that he doesn't like on them to push them away. So now they will be impure and away from him, and that's their punishment. So really, I don't think they are so contradictory, these two texts, in my view. I think they work together. And the reason I think they work together is because the idea that disability as divine punishment is so central that the New Testament argues with it. And if the New Testament argues with something, that means everyone believed it, right? And I gave you one example. I really like it because it's a story that has a take also in the Quran. The Quran retells it because the Quran doesn't like what happens here in the New Testament, so it tells it again. So I really love this story because it's like a Hebrew Bible, New Testament, Quran story, you know, that goes. So this is from John. As he walked along, that's Jesus, yes? As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth, meaning he's not an old man, he's blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So the disciples assume, it's a common sense, remember? Their common sense is that if they see a blind parent, him or his parents have sinned. For them, it's obvious. And like many stories in the New Testament, Jesus is going to contradict this obvious understanding, right? That for them, it's obvious. And of course, they represent the Jewish understanding of their time. And Jesus answered, neither this man or his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And then, of course, he cures him. So this is a very weird thing, because if I was that, blind person, I would say, really, I have to suffer all that just so, Jesus can perform a miracle? But that's what the New Testament says. And luckily, it's not my job to work with the moral problems of the New Testament. I only have to deal with the moral problems of the Old Testament, meaning the Hebrew Bible. And that's enough, for a lifetime. So I will leave that to, my colleagues that go and speak in other contexts. But for me, what's important in this story is that the students of Jesus assume it's obvious for them that if that person is blind, it's a divine punishment. It's obvious for them. They don't even, and that for me shows that what's going on in the Hebrew Bible continued to be kind of a common understanding later on. So that's kind of wait a minute. That's kind of also an answer to what you, Seth, was asking. I think that like many things in theology, really, it's really not the topic, but I can't hold myself. Yeah, Nancy, what you are writing is really true. It's hard to read and speak at the same time. What's really interesting for me, and I think it has to do not only with the topic of today's speech, but it's more general. But now I've lost my thread because I read the chat. I shouldn't have read the chat. Okay, I remembered. What's interesting about theology in general, really, that what is theology? We live in a chaotic world, and we try to create order in this chaotic world. And part of our deep human attempt to create order in this world is to believe that there is some kind of a divine order. And not only that there is divine order, but we can reveal it and follow it and perform certain things that will make this order work for us. And that's the basic theological thing, and it's common to all religions. All religions that I know try to create some kind of sense in the chaos that is life. and they try to understand the order behind this chaos and this divine order behind the chaos in most religions, or in all religions. If there are religions, there is a divine. So they try to understand the divine order. And many times they get to a certain understanding and they think, oh, we got it. But then something in reality proves that it wasn't true. The best example is, the biblical notion that if you do good, you will be rewarded in your lifetime. You will get money, you will have children, and you will live a long and healthy life. That's the biblical, generally notion of divine reward if you keep the law. But then you read the book of Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes or Kohelet is like, well, I met people who follow the law and they're miserable. And, I saw cases that this divine order doesn't work. And it's really annoying, right? He's really depressed by it. So we all find this example. And what happens is that sometimes the reality doesn't, meet our understanding of the divine order. And then we can choose how to behave. We can choose, now I'm becoming like a rabbi, but we can choose.
I was going to say, we have to bring you back for another session to go into the theology, right? All of the theological questions.
Well, I never considered this path, but
yeah.
What I'm saying here is that then we can consider, we can, reshape our theology, or we can say, oh, this is stupid, I'm becoming secular. We can do all kinds of things. But generally speaking, that happens. And the same happens with disabilities, okay? It's the same thing. So we have this notion that, oh, if someone is disabled, it's kind of, unfortunately, pretty fashionable now in certain evangelistic circles, well, if you're rich, that means God loves you, so you're doing the right thing. And if you're poor, so that means, okay, what the heck, God doesn't like you. I met people who think that way, right? So, the Hebrew Bible thought that if you're disabled, generally, if you're disabled, then there is a reason for that. And maybe in a certain point, people are starting to say, well, I know a blind person who's never sinned, and his parents never sinned. So how do we explain that? Maybe there is another way to explain it. So it's a very similar process to what happened with Kohelet, with Ecclesiastes. You find some kind of a crack in what you were thinking was a very good explanation of some bad things that happened to people, and now you have to re-understand it all over again. Yeah, that's a difficult thing to do. Right? That's not a very easy thing to do. So maybe that's a good way, because I see we have like 13 minutes. So that brings me to like 2 points. And we already naturally went there. So, it kind of naturally going there. But 2 points that come up for me from what I was showing you. Maybe we don't need the slides. That way I can see all of you. It's better. One is, it's true. There is some kind of gap still. On the one hand, we have laws, the purity laws, and we have the stories, and we have all this poetic and symbolic load and theological load of disabilities in the Bible. But on the other hand, we still do have a demand of grace. So we do have those places where people are asked, well, help the blind, help the deaf, help the lame. Don't make them fall. Don't mislead them. When God saves Israel, he will save the disabled with the rest of Israel. This is a very important saying, even though it's not the main voice. But it's a voice that we can start from. And this voice is an important voice because for me and I'm saying it as a person who's interested in rights, in human rights in general. For me, grace is a very good starting point, but it cannot stop there. And for that, I wanted to share with you something that is very central in disability studies in the last, I don't know, few decades. And that is noticing that in this world, and you know, you and I live in countries that really represent the two ends of that spectrum. So there is the edge that comes from the notion of grace. Okay, so we need to help the disabled. And I'm not saying it's not true, but something about the notion of grace is also maintaining a hierarchy. So they always need to be helped. And I am the strong one who helps. And there is something about it that is very helpful, very useful, but maintains some kind of hierarchy. You know, there is it's kind of a silly example, but it shows how deep it goes. You know that in Israel, that, you know, there are a lot of social help in Israel, a lot of, you know, financial help, and in the education system is very, you know, supportive of all kinds of disabilities, etc. But on the other hand, let's say if you are a blind professor, you will still, you can be a professor, a full professor. But if you're blind, for example, you will still work at the university under, you know, the Ministry of Supporting People. I don't know how you call it in English, because you don't have this ministry in the US, but of welfare, the Ministry of Welfare. So you will always, even if you're like a full professor, you're always employed through the fact that you're disabled. So there is something that takes grace as the main moral of how to treat the challenges that disabled people have. And on the other extreme end, we have the US. At least that's how I look at it, or anthropologists of disabilities look at it, where the main moral or the main concept that leads is human rights. So every human right, every person has a certain rights. So it's not about helping them, it's about giving rights. And that's a very different, I know it's very subtle and it's kind of hard to explain it, but I think these are kind of two very, very different things. And then these are cultural sentiments, really. It's not only structures, it's cultural sentiments. You know, I've watched Crip Camp. I hope if you didn't, you have to watch it. It's like a mandatory film. Everyone has to watch it. Right? I was really disappointed that it didn't win the Oscar. But you have to watch Crip Camp, because for me, as an Israeli, it really showed how deep the idea of human rights is in the American system versus in the Israeli system, where it almost doesn't exist. Okay, so it's very interesting. This is a little bit, I went a bit far from biblical studies, but what I wanted to say is that when I read the Hebrew Bible, I can find the places where the Bible leads us to, you know, grace, support, help. But for me, as a contemporary person, it's not enough. I want more. I want something more deep. I want the born in the image to be there. And because the Hebrew Bible doesn't do it, I have to do it myself. So, and that's kind of the last thing I wanted to say. And going back to my rabbi position, I think really when we face those things, when we face a biblical text that annoys us, and that really is like, what were they thinking, you know? And it happens. We have to remind ourselves well, we can go with, well, it was different times, they had different ideas, and yeah, we can also abandon it altogether. But I think that it's impossible. It's impossible to abandon it altogether because it's everywhere. Even if I personally decide, I'm not Jewish anymore, or whatever, I'm a secular person, I don't do a lot of things that Jews are supposed to do, but I can't escape it because it's everywhere. It's in my language. It's in all Western literature that was written, with inspiration of this book. It's in every play that I watch, in every commercial that I see, and so I cannot escape it. And that means that I have, the ways to deal with it will be very similar to the ways that we deal with other things that we don't like in the Tanakh. The most famous example is, feminist readings of the Tanakh. And we can see what happened. It went in, kind of three directions in my view. One direction is, okay, this is a horrible text. There is actually a book called A Text of Terror. It's one of the most famous feminist books about the Bible. So Text of Terror says, well, this is a horrible book. We don't want it. That's one way to go about it. The other way to go about it is to say, well, we don't understand, really. We should just, dig out the positive parts, kind of tangle with it. Or we can say, well, now this is part of it, so let's look at it. Let's look at it. We won't make it something that it's not, but we can look at it, and we have the power to interpret, because the power to interpret is the one thing that keeps a tradition alive. Why do I say that? Because if you are a tradition that has a text that is not allowed to change this text, right? And you carry this text with you for 2,000, 3,000 years, okay? Let's do the average, 2,500 years. And the times change, geography change, climate change, food changes, technology changes, and also morals change and ideas change. So if you don't want to throw it away and you want to keep it, you have to interpret it, because by interpreting it, you don't only change it, you also save it. Because if you won't change it by interpretation, you will not be able to keep it. So I think that, like in other topics with disabilities, I think that first we have to learn and face the simple fact that the Bible is not very progressive. But we can use all our methods of interpretation that help us to maintain this book while keeping with our own morals, with our own sensibilities, and with our own, perception of how humans should treat each other. So that was like the end of my speech.
Thank you so much, Yael. Really, you opened up, so many very, very important questions through this really exquisite readings of
Thank you.
biblical text. It's a great way to get into it. And like I said, I think we need to bring you back and do more. There's all of the theological pieces and how do we relate to this as moderns. It's really important.
I would say לשנה הבאה בניו יורק הבנויה.
That's right. Next year in open New York. So we are very, very grateful. We are grateful that we have learned to be able to bring people in from Israel in this way, and that we've been able to have your voice here this morning.
Thank you.
And I'm grateful to all who've tuned in. And yes, Yael, if you would, I think I would, and I think others would be interested to see the PowerPoint presentation with the citation. So if you send that to me, I'll send it on to everyone who was here today.
Okay, I will send it to you.
That'd be wonderful.
I'll do it right away so I don't forget.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua tov.
Just
Thank you
wonderful.
so much.
Thank you.
It was really great.